Hi, I'm Linda Leathersitch.
And I'm Stephanie Sheridan.
And we are Stitched Together Studios. And we're going to show you today how we bind our quilts and how we bind all of the beautiful Benartex quilts that we work on. Okay, first things first, we have to trim our quilt so that it's square so the binding will go on easily. I'm using a cutting mat with the grid. And I'm trimming it so that it's square. I know that it's square, but I also will put on my larger square so that I know that all my corners are going to be beautiful. After the quilt's squared up, we need to measure to find out exactly how many inches of binding we need. So for that, I'm going to use just this regular ruler. If it were a large quilt, I would use a
measuring tape.
A measuring tape. Okay, that's what I would do. This quilt is 16 by 20, so that would mean that it's 40, 50, 60, 72 inches all the way around it. And to that 72, I'm going to add 15 inches just to take care of those corners and when I do the joining of the binding. When I'm cutting my binding, I cut them 2 1/4 inches. Most of the time that is exactly what I want. Occasionally, if I have a flannel quilt or maybe minky, I might cut it 2 1/2. But for me, the 2 1/4 works best. I cut binding straight a grain, which is from selvage to selvage. And again, the exception to that would be if I'm working on a quilt that has a curved border, then I would cut it on the bias. But for the purposes today, and for probably 95% of the quilts I do, I want to cut them 2 1/4 inches, and I want to go selvage to selvage. The next step is to sew the binding strips together. So we'll take each one, lay one over the top right sides together with maybe just a scant 1/8 of an inch showing on either side. And what we're going to need to do is sew from this corner to this corner. It can be accomplished in several different ways. You can eyeball it and hope you come out close. I've done that. You can use a ruler and a pencil or a chalk and make a line, and you can sew on that. You could take it to your ironing board and press it and then sew in the crease that you've created, or you can do it the way Stephanie and I do it. And what we've done is we've prepared our machine by putting the needle down, taking a ruler and butting it up next to the needle, making sure that it's straight on this line as well as this line, so we're exactly straight out from the needle, and then in some way mark that line. Now Stephanie's used a piece of tape. You could use a permanent pen or pencil. I guess a pencil wouldn't be permanent, so you'd use a pen. At home I used a pin and scratched a line. Anything that will show you a line straight out from the needle. And once you've done that, you realign your fabric, right sides together, bring it up to the machine, and you'll be sewing from one corner to the other. And while you're doing that, you'll be following this little corner right exactly on this line. And so when you get done sewing, you'll be right at that corner. And I stop with the needle up, and then I'm going to take the rest of that piece and put it right side up, take the next piece of binding, and what I'm doing today is using two very obviously different colors so that it'll be easier for you to see what it is that I'm doing. I just put the needle down, put it right in that corner, by using different colors of fabric, it will make it easier to see how it is that I'm going to join these at the end. And I'm using a color of thread that I probably would not actually use. And again, it's right sides together, and bring it up. And you'll continue doing this until you have everything in one very long strip of fabric for your binding. Cut your thread and you have this great big long piece. Okay, the next step is to trim any threads that you may have and cut your pieces apart. And then you're going to trim the excess fabric off with about 1/4 inch seam. I save these little pieces, and on a day when I don't really feel like quilting, I put them all together and make a fun little piece. After I have all of these cut off, I'm going to take it to my ironing board and I'm going to press all of these seams open. And after I have that done, I'm going to put wrong sides together and press it to create a strip that is 1 1/4 inches wide, or 1 1/8 inches wide, by whatever my length might be. Okay, we've got all of our binding pieced and pressed. We've got our quilt top ready to go. It's quilted, it is trimmed. Now we have to determine where we're going to put our binding, and that depends entirely on how you plan on finishing your quilt. The Benartex quilts all get done machine both sides. A lot of mine do too. Certainly it's much easier. Or a lot of people put their binding on the top of the quilt, fold it to the back, and then hand sew it on. So that's what we're going to be doing today, and I'll show you the other way at the very end. So for today, this is the top of our quilt. This beautiful Benartex fossil fur fabric is the back of our quilt. We're going to be sewing this again using our walking foot, and when we sew we have the folded side in towards the middle of the quilt. We're going to start by leaving about an 8-inch tail, and I'm just going to lay it so that the raw edges are all together, and I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam. I know exactly where that is on my presser foot. Probably be a good idea for you to check for yours. And what I'm going to do is sew only about 1 inch, cut my thread, and take the quilt off. What I'm going to be doing here is to fold that binding around and make sure that I have plenty of room to stitch it down on the other side. If my seam on this side were too deep or too large, when I flipped it over and I could still see maybe the stitching on the back, I know that I would have to rip this 1 inch out and start again. But the 1/4 inch seam that I'm using is going to work. I'll be able to fold it over to the back and hand stitch it down very easily. So once I've determined that I haven't messed that up, I'm going to put it back under the presser foot and continue sewing using my 1/4 inch seam. And again, I'm using a thread that I'm hoping that you'll be able to see on the video easily. As I'm sewing down along, about 4 or 5 inches from the corner, I'm doing a couple different things, and one of them is I'm looking to see if there's a join. I do not want to get to a corner and have that fabric joined. It just doesn't fold pretty. So what I would do if that were the case, I would stop sewing right here, take my quilt out from underneath the foot, I would cut here, and then I would repiece it press that seam open and continue sewing. Luckily for me, I am not in danger of doing that on this corner. Now, I like to live dangerously, and I just sew all the way around and take care of it as I go. Stephanie, the planner of the two, she tends to lay out all of her binding all the way around the quilt to make sure that she's not going to have a join on the corner. And if there is one, she'll just make a slight switch and maybe start her binding up a little further. Probably a good idea. Okay, I'm going to just continue sewing down towards the corner. When I'm just a couple inches away from that corner, I'm going to take a straight pin. Aren't these fun? We were shopping. And right here is the corner. And I'm going to put that pin in so it comes straight between the two edges. And I'm going to sew up just till I get to that pin and take it out. And then I'm going to turn my quilt a quarter turn, and I'm going to sew right off the edge. You can see the then I'm going to flip my fabric straight up, put my finger there, and straight down. So now my fabric is straight across the top, straight here. Everything's looking good. I'm going to slide it back under the presser foot, start sewing at the very edge, right even off of the fabric a little bit, and lay this down. And I'm just going to continue this around the other three corners, and I'll get right back with you. Okay, we're coming up on the last corner of the quilt. I've already got my pins stuck in, so I know exactly where to stop sewing. So I kind of go slow and stop, turn the corner, and sew off. Use this nifty thread cutter that comes on my beautiful Bernina 640. Fold it up, straight down, put it in place, start just before the fabric starts, and start sewing my 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm on the last side. And I'm going to stop sewing at least 8 to 10 inches. And I'm going to back stitch here and use my thread cutter. The next part is probably the scariest of all before you've done these several hundred times as I have, is how to get this piece and this piece together and have it look good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the piece that we started with and smooth it down. Oh, I don't like long threads. I'm going to trim those off. Smooth it down, and then about half of the distance between the starting spots, I'm going to stop this darker fabric or your beginning fabric and just do a finger press across there. I've lined the folds up so that when I cut this across, it's going to be exactly straight. Save this piece to go with those half square triangles that I cut off. And I'm going to pin this in place. I'm going to bring my other fabric up, and again I'm going to smooth it down, fold it back, and leave between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch opening between the raw edge and the folded edge. And then what I'm going to do is finger press that with my fingernails. Or if you have one of those handy dandy little wooden presser things that you bought, because everybody bought them, this would be a fun thing to do. What I'm going to be using here is a 2.5-inch square and a roller chalk marker. If you don't have these toys, you can use a 3-inch square or whatever's necessary here. But I have to measure back as far as I'm going to cut. And that measurement is whatever you cut the width of your binding plus 1/4 inch. For us today, that's 2 1/4 inches plus 1/4 inch makes it 2.5. How nice that this ruler is exactly 2.5. Certainly makes this easier, so I'm going to place it exactly. Whoops. And then I'm going to do it again after I got the chalk open, because I didn't do that chalk beforehand. And do a nice mark across so I can see exactly. Now, if you had cut your binding wider, say 2.5 inches instead of 2 1/4, this amount would be 2.5 plus 1/4, so you would be cutting this 2 3/4. Where I have that chalk mark, I'm going to cut it right across there. Stephanie thought that was pretty scary the first time she did it. I'm going to take the pin out, and now I've got both of my pieces, and I really want this kind of out of the way, so I'm just going to take a little tuck or a pleat, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to pin it up so it's out of the way. I'm going to take the piece of binding on my right side where that fold is. I'm going to open it up and just lay it flat down so my fold comes straight down here. This is my fold here. Now these of course have to be right sides together or it's really not going to come out good at all. So I've got the fold coming along here. I'm putting them right sides together, and I'm going to leave about 1/8 inch on either side. And it's really important that you pin this because they will slide and it will be really difficult for you. So again, if you look at this, you've created an L or a V, however you want to try to remember this. And we're going to sew from this corner to this corner, just like when we put the binding fabric together. And once again, I'm going to use the mark that we have on the sewing machine cabinet as my guide to sew from one corner to the other. And I'm going to take the pin out as I sew along because I'll be embarrassed if I have to change a needle while we're doing this. Cut my thread. Okay, and I'm going to trim that thread that I started with. I'm going to take this pin out so that I can lay the quilt flat. Now this is the absolute most important part of the whole deal. And that is, before you trim any of this fabric off, you have to make sure that this is going to fit. And it's absolutely perfect, just like we knew it would be. Yeah, right. So now we're going to trim this off. At 1/4 inch, approximately. And of course, being very careful that the only thing that you're trimming off is that piece. And then we're going to press this seam open. Put this back under the presser foot. Put it in place. And once again, using that 1/4 inch seam, we're going to sew down and backstitch, trim the thread, and there you are, ready to finish your quilt. If you're going to be hand sewing this, you would bring it to the back of your quilt, pin it in place, pin it in place. place over here. Push your thumb in there and just, I hope you can see it with this dark thread. I'll do it on one of the other corners just in case you can't. And pin it. And now you're ready to do a whip stitch and simply stitch that binding down. If you are going to be doing this machine both sides, then what we're going to do is switch this around and say this is the bottom of your quilt. This now becomes the top of your quilt through the magic of the video. So what we would do then is I usually start in a corner, bring the binding over, bring the binding over, finish the corner so it's nice and pretty. And I would pin all the way around, and then what I would do is put this under the machine. The trick to doing machine binding on both sides, anyway, that I think it makes it work best for me, is I'm going to put invisible thread in my bobbin. Now when you're going to use invisible thread in your bobbin, there's a couple tricks or facts, whatever, that you need to know, and that is you can only fill your bobbin a third full. You don't want it any fuller than a third, and Stephanie's going to tell you why.
Because if you try to fill it too full and you're using a plastic bobbin, your bobbin will explode.
Do we need to ask
me
you
how I know?
And the thread went all over. It was quite humorous when she called me about it. If you're using a metal bobbin, it will bend them. So please only fill that bobbin about a third of the way full. And if you have any choice as far as how fast that thread is going through, you want it to go very slow. Okay, I've pinned most of the way around at least one side so that you can see what I'm doing. Put my presser foot down, and I'm going to put the needle down, and then I'm going to take this pin out. And as I sew along the very close to the edge with the walking foot, I'm going to use my handy dandy poker. I think it's called a stylus, but it's a poker to me. And as I stitch, I'm going to stitch very, very close to the edge, remembering that I have invisible thread in my bobbin. So it's not going to show on the back hardly at all. I'll get back with you when I get to the other corner of this. Okay, I'm approaching the next corner. And again, I'm slowly sewing towards that corner. As I get to the corner, I'm going to stop with the needle down, move my pin out so that I don't sew over it. When I get to the exact corner there, I'm going to take one or maybe two stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch. With the needle down, I'm going to turn the quilt. As you can see, I've sewn really close. The thread doesn't show as much as I thought it would, but maybe it shows more on the dark. I'm going to put the presser foot down, take 2 stitches backwards, and then start sewing forward. And this holds that corner very easily. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this and you found it helpful. We are Stitched Together Studios. I'm the mother.
I'm the daughter.
And we love quilting, especially with Benartex.